So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this AACOM forum series on transitions in medical education, hosted by the Assembly of Osteopathic Graduate Medical Educators, AOGME, and AACOM's Council on Residency Placement, CORP. This session will provide an introduction to research for osteopathic medical students. My name is Dr. Holly Waters, and I'm an assistant professor of osteopathic principles and practice and the OPP Predoctoral Fellowship co-director at Nova Southeastern University's Dr. Kiran Patel College of Osteopathic Medicine. And as a member of AACOM's Council on Residency Placement, I'm happy to be here to be your facilitator today. Before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded, and that recording will be posted on the AACOM website shortly afterwards. All participants in this webinar are in listen-only mode, so you won't be able to speak during this session. If you do experience any technical issues during the webinar, please use the chat feature and a representative will be there to assist you. We'll have limited time for questions during this session, but if you have any specific questions, you're welcome to submit them through the Q&A at any time, and if the time permits, we will be able to discuss them. So continuing on, the speakers for this educational activity do not have any relevant financial relationships to disclose with ineligible companies whose primary business is producing, marketing, selling, reselling, or distributing healthcare products used by or on patients. So now, to introduce our panelists, we have Dr. Amanda Brooks, who's the Vice Provost of Research and Scholarly Activity at Rocky Vista University. She's an accomplished researcher with a strong focus on molecular biology. Her career includes a postdoctoral research fellowship at the University of California, San Diego, research roles at the University of Wyoming, and an assistant professor position at North Dakota State University. Dr. Jane Dumsha is the Chief Research Operations Officer at Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. She oversees daily operations, managing the dissemination of research opportunities, reviewing and approving proposals for various sponsors, and facilitating the review and negotiation of agreements and proposals. Dr. Joseph Benoit is a professor of physiology and pathology at Burrell College of Osteopathic Medicine. Dr. Benoit's early research focused on microvascular physiology, vascular skew, smooth muscle regulation, and lymphatic physiology. In recent years, he's directed his efforts towards new and emerging medical schools, engaging in curriculum design, establishing research infrastructure, fostering faculty development, and delivering impactful teaching. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us today, and we'll be getting started with a presentation by Dr. Benoit.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers for giving us an opportunity to speak to you today. At the end of the session, really what we want to do is to try to present an overview for you guys that will enumerate, differentiate, apply, determine, identify, and support your efforts to enter research as a medical student. And the research process involves a variety of steps. We're going to talk about some of those today. Being able to talk about research versus non-research activities. So research and creative scholarship are on our agenda today. Being able to apply some of what you learned here into your quest to identify a research project. And moving on down the line, ultimately, identify activities that can enhance your residency applications. It's important to keep in mind that, and I'll say this a few times in this presentation, that your residency application is not solely dependent upon research. It's just one component of it. So could we go to the next slide, please? Now, with all things, there are metrics, and publications do fit into that. One of the reasons that it's important for not only medical schools, but for you to get involved in extracurricular activities, research being one of them, is that it can enhance your reputation as a scholar, and it can also provide opportunities for you to give you a leg up on certain residency requirements. So when we look at this, I think it's important to think institutionally. We have to track and provide updates on opportunities that may be available for you as institutions. Ultimately, you are going to engage in research and have presentations and posters that will come out of that. And the publications will involve original research, but it's also important to think about the fact that case reports are scholarly activity and that they can still count towards publications that you can report. And in many ways, they do help your reputation as a scholar. There's a lot of benefits to that. Next slide. So why would one do research? And, I'm going to start at the bottom of this list. So when you look at it institutionally, research fulfills ACGME requirements. So that's the very base bottom line of why do research. Now, if you look at the top of this list, you can see that the benefits of research really center on the ability of you as a practitioner down the road to practice evidence-based care. So along the way, and as you are embarking on your research career, you're probably thinking, okay, well, it's going to enhance my residency match. That indeed will happen. But what are some of the other benefits? And I think the middle part of this list becomes one of the more important reasons, is one, to develop more future mentors. Now, part of your experience as a student will be working with a mentor or mentors. And these individuals, believe it or not, will follow you throughout your career. So I'm approximately 40 years after my PhD, still in contact with my mentor, and still find that my mentors occasionally just reach out and either provide an opportunity or something comes up down the road that's tied to the research that I did with them many, many years ago. So this whole networking, the ability to learn and meet other people who are working in the same area as you becomes important. Contribute to the literature where it'll be widely read by others around the world. And then as you're moving up, you can see that you can improve programming and education for future students and improve patient care and safety. So all of these things come into line as to why do research. And I wouldn't just concentrate on, well, it's going to help me get a good residency. You're embarking on something that's basically going to be a career enhancer for the rest of your career. Next slide. So I mentioned that case reports are not research, but case reports can inform and stimulate research. And what's happened in recent years has been an exponential increase in the number of case reports being published. And case reports come in a wide variety of flavors. It can be just a single patient case report. It could be an adverse response report, maybe to a pharmaceutical agent. It could be a medical mystery type of case report. And there are many other ones there. A single patient treatment might be a case report. And we've seen all of those from our institution in recent years with students involved in them. So if you see where I've put case reports here, case reports are kind of in the center, and case reports can lead to clinical research. A single observation could indeed lead to more and more research in the field. So if you think about areas where that has happened, it has happened in through the years. HIV was reported in a case report as really a infection or a disease that was occurring, but no one knew what it was. You've also seen other case reports through the years where there have been no previous reports of something that stimulated a lot of research and ultimately clinical management of the case. And the basic research that comes off of that is nonetheless the same. So a case report, a clinical observation, could lead to the development of an animal model and in vitro studies, which then lead to development of new pharmaceuticals and other related things. So the goal is to create generalizable knowledge from research, but case reports often form the initial basis of that. Next slide. So in this slide, what we're showing is a hierarchy of research evidence. And I'm using the clinical science example here, but a similar example, I should say, could be developed for bench science, social and behavioral science, and even medical education research, where you go from very broad, maybe an initial observation. So a case series may provide an initial observation or a group of initial observations, but without a comparison. So typically when you're looking at a case series or expert opinion, someone is reporting something, but it's not compared and it's not necessarily statistically validated. But as you move up to cross-sectional studies, case control studies, cohort studies, and clinical trials, you are beginning to gather more and more evidence and more statistically based evidence. So that with a clinical trial, you may take something that might have been an initial observation, and now it's moving towards a treatment or an intervention in hundreds, if not thousands, of patients that are involved in the clinical trial. Now, a single clinical trial outcome is not considered at the top of the pyramid. Systematic reviews and meta-analyses where individuals have published studies on the same topic many times incorporate multiple studies and get us closer to the top of the pyramid, which is, like I tell many of our students here, truth in the universe. So if you start with a case series or an expert opinion, it's an observation often and observational studies. But if you continue to move up the pyramid, you get closer and closer to a global type of consensus on a scientific finding or a clinical treatment regimen. So the systematic reviews and meta-analyses obviously are at the top of the pyramid, but they're also the ones that are going to be more time consuming, more involved, and you might want to keep that in mind as you are conducting research. You might want to do something more along the lines of a case control or a cohort study where you would be able to complete the research in a finite amount of time as a medical student. Next slide. So in a nutshell, yes?
I was just saying, is this where I'm taking over, Dr. Benoit?
Yes, you can go ahead and take over here.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Benoit. So it is a pleasure to be here, as Dr. Benoit has said, and I am super excited to talk about this, talk about these topics with you, because I think that this is something we're all so passionate about, and Dr. Benoit has given us such a nice foundation for this. So when we look at it, oftentimes research to medical students feels like it's kind of that hard nut to crack. So we wanted to start out by telling you, what is research in a nutshell? First of all, you develop the idea, you formulate the question, you review the literature, and that's the intimidating part that's really hard to get the nuts started. So we're going to really focus in this part of the presentation on how do we do that. Also, you have to make sure that you know why you're doing what you're doing and that you have a really good, solid methodology. And I thought that Dr. Benoit's hierarchy of evidence was a great way to start that, to talk about how in the world are we going to assess, did we do a good level of study for the question we're trying to answer? And we're going to get into that a little bit later on in this part of the presentation. So let's first start by, how do you actually find an idea? How do you start developing an idea? Next slide, please. So where do we get those ideas? And one of the things that I love doing with students is I ask them, why'd you come to medical school? Why are you doing what you're doing? Because they all have an idea. They all are passionate about something, and that's where we start. Next bullet point, please. So sometimes it's cases we've seen, people we know that are struggling with a specific thing that we're like, man, that's really interesting. I really want to dig deeper into that. Next bullet point, please. It could be patterns we've noticed. This is something that's really interesting. We're doing a study looking at long COVID development. And I had an investigator come to me and say, well, I'm really interested if it developed more frequently in California because of the wildfires. We thought, well, that's an interesting question. Let's dive in. So that's a pattern that we've potentially noticed. Next bullet point, please. Hot topics in the news. This is a great way to look at it. Oftentimes we see these popular media stories, and I would challenge you to go deeper. Figure out, is this true or is this sensationalized? So look at those hot topics in the news. Next bullet point, please. You might have questions from patients. When you're in your third or fourth year, they might ask you a question. You're like, wow, that's a really interesting point. I had not thought of it that way. So be open and willing to try to be a little more introspective on those questions, and don't just dismiss some of those things that you're like, oh, well, everybody will know that. Look into it. Make sure that people know that. Next bullet point, please. Questions from your colleagues, questions from other students, questions from your professors, questions that you might have when you're sitting in courses and you're like, gosh, why do the kidneys do that? Why does glomerular filtration rate change based on all these different things? That's a good place to start in that idea development process. Next bullet point, please. Journal articles you've read. This is a great place. Now I'm going to give you a little tip that I usually tell students. Look at the end of the article, because in the end of an article, oftentimes a really good article will say, here are gaps in the field. This is where we think our research fits in, and this is where we think the field is going. That's a great way for you to get an idea of, does my idea have some legs here? Does it have a place in the field? Next bullet point, please. And it gives you interesting topics. Next bullet point, please. And again, it suggests that future for research. Next bullet point. And when you go to conferences, this is the last thing that I will mention on this particular how to find that idea, is think about the posters and the presentations that you've seen. Have they prompted your thinking in a new way? Have they taught you new ways to look at these different topics? I also encourage our students, because I think every college and university has these research days, look at the abstracts being presented in research day and say, oh gosh, what did these students do before? And can I add to that? Next slide, please. Now, the next, everybody's probably heard of PICO questions. I want you to challenge yourself to think finer. Finer means feasibility, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. So PICO questions are important, and they're very, very relevant, especially when you're doing very clinical research. But as researchers, we also want to think finer. Is our idea even feasible? And is it relevant? The novel part of it comes up because we don't want to keep repeating specifically human subjects research that's been done in the past. It's one of our general principles for ethics, is making sure that we're not repeating things that have been done over and over again. And I'll just leave that link there as advice from somebody who's been there before that you can look at to try to understand a little bit deeper what that finer criteria might look like for your particular topic. Next slide, please. So your next step is to refine your idea. So go to the literature, seek established clinical or research mentors, talk about your idea. I think sometimes we get these ideas and we love them so much and we try to hold them so close that we end up shutting off some really great avenues of discussion. So don't be afraid to talk about your idea. I once had a mentor tell me that if you're afraid to talk about your idea, you don't have enough ideas. So don't be afraid to talk about your ideas. Talk about them with your professors, talk about them with your other colleagues, with your students, with your preceptors. Reach out to other disciplines, talk to people in psychology, talk to people in behavioral sciences, talk to people in public health. They will give you insight. Talk to people in engineering. They'll give you insight into how you might want to think about your question. And then watch, be a watcher, be an observer. Just like we tell you, observe your patients, observe how they walk, observe how they're acting. Be an observer. And then again, seek out those ideas from the published literature, go to conferences, go to lectures, ask questions. Don't be afraid about looking silly. The people who learn the most ask questions, even if, and again, I challenged myself once when I went to a conference, ask a question with everything. Even if you think that somebody else is going to think you're stupid, ask the question. It was the best networking opportunity for me. So ask the question. And then get started using literature databases. You should be familiar with both basic science and clinical research databases and use them both. When you are starting to develop your research idea, don't be afraid to do that. Next slide, please. Review the literature. We already talked a little bit about this, and I just want to highlight the keywords part because, again, this is another kind of tripping point for some students and even some faculty is identifying those right keywords and phrases that make it possible for you to find information. So there's a couple great tools out there, some AI-based tools. The one I like particularly well is called the Stiller SR. If you don't know about that, see if you can look into that. And I use mesh searching a lot when I do my searches because I might not understand or know all the syntax that somebody else is going to use. Maybe they're going to put that word first or second. And so I use mesh search terms. And that gives me a really good broad sense of the literature. And then make sure that you select those and you search all those right databases. Develop your list a priori. So before you even start doing the literature search, are you going to include literature on pediatrics or are you going to exclude it? So kind of develop those rules that you're going to use as you go through your literature search. Next slide, please. Then after you get those results, arrange them around and related to specific research question you're developing. So here's exactly what I do. And you guys are going to think, gosh, Dr. Brooks has a PhD already. Why does she still create high school level outlines? It's because this is how I organize my thoughts and how I organize my literature reviews. So I create an outline. And I always ask myself this question. If I were going to explain this to my parents, if I were going to explain this to a loved one that didn't have the same level of knowledge that I have on this, what kinds of questions would they ask me? Because those are often going to be the topics that you need to cover. So those are the topics, and sometimes those are the same as your keywords. So if you're really stuck on your keywords, create your outline first, then go back to your keywords. After you start reading the literature, you're going to synthesize those results and basically summarize what's known and what are the gaps. Make sure you identify what the gaps are. Oftentimes, this is the step where I find that it's useful to make sure you are very clear on your goal. Why are you doing the literature review? Are you trying to advocate for something? Are you trying to point out a problem with current treatment regimens? Why are you doing this? Be clear on that, and that will help you arrange your results and really figure out the most meaningful aspects of all of those to identify those gaps or areas of controversy. And that will help you refine and reformulate your questions that need further research so that you can be that person who puts it in your conclusion and helps the next generation of people coming behind you. Next slide, please. And then finally, and Dr. Benoit, I'm going to pull it back to his research hierarchy. You want to make sure you have a good foundation. So consult with somebody knowledgeable about statistics. Don't wait till you get your data to think about the statistics and how you want to analyze your data. Make sure that that comes kind of at the very beginning, because if you don't, you're going to miss the boat and you might be gathering the wrong data or asking the wrong questions. So consult with somebody who really knows a lot about statistics, because they're going to help vet your design. And they're going to say, oh, if you collect this data and this data, that's going to make it messy for you. Or, oh, you don't need to collect all that demographic information because you don't necessarily care how they have their gender identity. You don't care about that. It's irrelevant to your question. Don't collect that information. And so you're only collecting the data that answers your question. And a statistician or somebody who's been doing this a really long time is going to help vet that idea for you. So make sure you consult with somebody because those descriptive statistics are often sufficient to answer the question you're trying to answer. And I think that's my last slide on this section. Next slide, please. Perfect. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Dosha.
Dr. Brooks. So I am also, in addition to my official title that you saw, unofficially the IRB Queen at PCOM, a title bestowed upon me upon one of our deans. So there used to be a commercial on television that said, you got to have a plan. Well, you have to have a plan. The other way of saying this is you don't want to just throw the pasta at the wall to see what is sticking. So if you need IRB approval down the road for your project, it helps you to get approval right out of the gate because you have a well thought out plan. But more important, it helps you with your thought processes. It helps you to organize your thoughts. So you can start with an outline, as Dr. Brooks and I both do, or whatever way works for you, but it needs to be well thought out. And then once you have this actual proposal or plan, it takes a village or a whole lot of people, as shown in the graphics, to do research. It's almost never one person doing the project. So if you have that, it's kind of a blueprint or a recipe so that everybody knows what to do, how to do it, and they follow that, and there's no deviation from the protocol. So again, back to the avoiding messy data, you won't have messy data because it will be collected in a consistent manner no matter who's collecting it. And it also facilitates the writing process, which is the end game, right? You're not going to do the research and put it on a shelf. You're going to do the research and do a poster, maybe eventually publish to disseminate your results, to let other people know what you've found, whether it's positive or negative. Next slide, please. So how do you find opportunities to do research? So this might seem like Captain Obvious, but look at the institution's website. So usually it's organized by topics or by the faculty that will list who the research director or dean or other administrator like me is. There are often research clubs at medical schools. And then last but not least, your Council of Student Government Presidents research rep. There's one on every single campus. So reach out to them. Again, do the literature search. That's how you can find opportunities because you can see who's publishing in that field. And it may be somebody where you're going to be doing a rotation, for example. Again, like we mentioned, poster presentations. Go talk to somebody, strike up a conversation if it's interesting. They may have room for you on their team. Some schools have internal competitions or funding opportunities, so things like travel awards for students that are supported by the Alumni Association, or internal grants to faculty that seed money to help them get preliminary data to do a full-blown grant application for external money. Also, look at sponsor websites, so things like voluntary health organizations such as the American Heart. If you're interested in cardiac research, for example, look at the American Heart Association website. And then there's reporter.nih.gov, which is a big, huge database of all the data, all the projects rather, currently and previously funded back quite a few years by the National Institutes of Health. So you can look by keyword, you can look by geography, you look by the name of somebody you see in the literature, or any combination thereof. Note, however, it's not generally feasible to try to get external funding yourself as a trainee. You would need to piggyback on an existing project because it takes a long time, and trust me, I've been doing this for years, to find the research opportunity, funding opportunity, apply for it, and then actually execute the project and do the closeout reports, data analysis, all that other kind of stuff. That may require an extra year of medical school, which you may or may not be interested in doing because it also obviously extends your debt. However, if you are interested, the American Osteopathic Association has training fellowships specifically if you're going to be doing OMT research. So what I say about getting funding is it's like human gestation, especially if it's for the federal government, but many other agencies as well. It's 9 months from the time you apply to the first time that you start. And 9 months is not enough time when you're a trainee. Next slide, please. So I have a whole separate presentation on this, but to summarize, it's really important to have a good match between you and your mentor or mentors, plural, because that's how you're going to get the most from the experience. Don't limit yourself thinking that it has to be a clinician. Let's just say you're going to do orthopedic surgery. It doesn't mean it has to be an orthopedic surgeon. So for example, there is a PhD at PCOM who does orthopedic research and is a great mentor. So that would be a good person to go and have as a mentor. And then that will prepare you for your orthopedic residency application. So it's very important for a mentor and mentee to either match or complement one another in terms of many things, including your goals, your previous research experience. So if you don't have much, you should find somebody who does. Your time commitments and theirs, your passion for the project and their passion for the project, and then personality. So I talk about this, the Stay Puft. So if you all remember from Ghostbusters, the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man looked nice, but was very destructive. And Attila the Hun was not the nicest guy in the world, but he was a very effective leader. But also think about if that's going to mesh well with your personality. If you need a softer, more gentle approach, you need to think about what kind of approach your mentor has to giving feedback, for example. Also, don't limit yourself to one mentor. Consider a panel or a team. So you might have different mentors for things like different skills, such as writing, doing the research, the clinical, the time management piece. You know, if you're really good at writing, they'll be really happy to have you on board. But if you're not, maybe find somebody with who does have writing skills, and you bring something else to the table. Think about it in terms of diversity. You may be interested in having a mentor who, for example, is an underrepresented minority or LGBTQ plus community member, if you are. Other characteristics, such as a first-generation student, which I happen to be. So I get what it's like to not have necessarily this formal and informal mentoring from family members, and maybe an alum of the institution. Also, if you have this team of mentors, you'll have cross-pollination. So you'll have different perspectives, different forms of coaching, different skill sets. And so and it's also less of a commitment for them. So they may be more amenable to being the mentor if they know that they're a member of a team. Next slide, please. So as a trainee, how can you get involved in research? So first I'll talk about types of activity. So we've talked about some of these, but things like doing the literature searching, you can help your mentor with that. That can be time consuming. They'd be very happy to help you, guide you through that. If you're doing sort of the legwork, you can do things like obtain informed consent if you're backing onto an existing project. You can do things like data entry. That's a very valuable skill. Writing and editing, and then things like analyzing data if you have that skill set. And I believe in that link that we had and the advice from someone who's been there, they were very good at data analysis. So they brought a lot to the team, because clinicians usually are not skilled in data analysis. So when is it feasible? Think about things like downtime. So maybe summer between first and second years, if you have some downtime, or even breaks, instead of going to Cancun, you might want to take that time to spend some time working on research if you're already involved in it. You can do research electives and also rotations in the specialty of interest to you. And if you put together an elective and rotation that's in your area of interest, you can obviously double your time. And also think of it as a long-term commitment. So you can't just kind of drop in by parachute and do research if you have a 1-month rotation. It really is a long-term commitment, because there's some training involved, whether it's the human subjects training or specific to the protocol. Things like there's always a learning curve. So we had somebody who had a lot of very enthusiastic students come to her before first year of medical school, and they all got trained. And then once they got into their coursework, they were nowhere to be seen, and she had spent a lot of time training them. So then, factor in that there's going to be a learning curve. And also research is a process. It's not just a one and done. It doesn't take a month. It doesn't take a week. It doesn't even take a year. It can take a lot longer than that, even for something that seems simple on the surface, like say a survey. It's important to be a team player. So for those folks that went and got trained by our faculty member and then didn't show up, that's not being a good team player. Okay, so she devoted a lot of time to them and then they weren't forthcoming about their commitments once they got into it. And then think about the overall achievement. What is it that you are seeking to achieve? And just like you have to walk before you run, you need to walk before you run with research, and maybe even crawl first, but you will have that sense of achievement if you put the time in. Next slide, please. So what types of research are best suited to trainees? So this is part of my forte, helping trainees with what's feasible for them, because we have a lot of different programs at PCOM, including master's and doctoral programs in other fields, and they have a finite amount of time in which to accomplish their research, do the analyses, and do the write-up. So things like secondary analysis of internal data or specimens, such as electronic health records. You can also do secondary analysis. So this is, by the way, the federal term, the term from the federal government and the federal regulations. Secondary analysis means it's already been collected. Now you're for a non-research purpose or even a research purpose, and now you're going back and doing a secondary analysis for your project. So external data, there are literally thousands of databases available from both federal and state governments for all different kinds of health data that you can examine. My PhD was using a CDC database. It was actually 4 different data sets from one particular project, but I was able to earn a PhD. Doesn't have to be that sophisticated, but it's out there and for you to use, and much of the time it's free. You can also do things like educational research. So for example, you could compare a course that was done by in-person versus virtual learning, and were the outcomes any different? And then you can do things like help write review articles. These are often by invitation only to a faculty member. They summarize the current state of understanding on a topic, but you can definitely help with the writing on that because it can be rather labor intensive. A typical review article will have over 100 references. So it draws from a much broader pieces of the literature, much broader scope of the literature than an original research article, for example. So you'll notice my asterisks, and now at the bottom, you must have IRB approval or an exempt determination before you can do these kinds of research, even if they don't seem like they're, dramatic, giving a new drug to a patient, that sort of thing. And there is a time factor involved. The national average is 3 months, depending on the type of review. So you need to factor that in, and that's also why it's good to piggyback onto existing projects that have already been approved. Next slide, please. So this is back to my IRB queen. So what is research and how does the federal government define it? I think there might be a bullet point in there, Ikram. If you could try clicking it. Okay. So anyway, it's a systematic investigation is the first part of the definition, and then designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. So that first part means, not throwing the pots at the wall. It can be a chart review. It can be a survey. It can be, a new drug, etc. And then the contributing to generalizable knowledge means a poster or presentation outside the 4 walls. So not just research day at your institution, but maybe a regional or national presentation, or also publication. Case reports, as we mentioned, aren't considered research because they're not a systematic investigation. It's standard of care, but they can still make a substantial contribution. And quality assurance, quality improvement projects can be research. They often are not. Again, one of the criteria is whether it's going to be outside the 4 walls of the institution. So when do you have to get IRB approval? So if it fits that federal definition of research and it indirectly or directly involves human subjects, you first have to get prior IRB review and approval, or an exempt determination. So examples of indirect involvement, which might not be as obvious, are things like the secondary analysis and chart reviews. And then direct involvement is things like surveys and educational intervention, or obviously drug studies. And also, when do you need to get it? Even before you start to explore data or specimens to see if you have enough and determine feasibility. Do that first. That is considered the first step in the research project, and you have to get IRB approval before you can start looking at data or specimens. And that's according to the feds, not just me. Next slide, please. Oh, there's the fly-in. Okay. So a really quick overview of the IRB process, because this is fairly universal, is that some sort of training is first required, and most places use CITI if you fit the federal definition of an investigator, depending on the activities in which you will be engaging. Then the principal investigator, usually a full-time faculty member, prepares and submits the protocol and any other study materials. Gets reviewed by an IRB administrator to make sure everything's complete and accurate. Then it goes to the board, unless it's exempt from informed consent, in which case it gets administrative review. And then most of the time you get a conditional acceptance letter. You do not get approval right out of the gate. You get a list of things that you need to go back and address before you can be approved. Then, so you or the PI does that, they resubmit. It's reviewed again by the administrator, usually not back to full committee, and then you get the approval letter and you're good to go. Next slide, please. So how do you stand out in a good way? So if you want to stand out and you're going for a competitive residency, or you definitely want maybe a less competitive residency, but it's in a particular location or with a particular mentor that you really want to work with, how do you do that? So get your name on publications. Think about how you can add value for time-constrained mentors. So it's not just take it from the mentors. You need to be a value-added proposition for them. So as I mentioned, things like writing, editing, helping to develop ideas, helping to analyze and interpret data, help to actually develop the existing, this is a big one. If they have an existing abstract or poster, help flesh that out into a full-blown manuscript. Often, to my frustration, things stop at the poster or presentation stage, but honestly, the heavy lifting, the hard work, the thinking process has already been done for the poster, and it's really just about putting more words on pages. So authorship goes in the order of substantial, direct, and intellectual contributions. So the greater your contribution, the higher up you'll be in the place of author. So if you're a fourth, fifth, sixth author, it's not as much recognition because it's not as much effort and contribution, and therefore it's not in the position of being first author that you would probably need for competitive residency. Oh, and you do not need an advanced degree. Don't think that you have to have fancy letters after your name or already be done med school in order to get your name on a paper. So back probably before you folks were born, when I worked at Jefferson as a clinical research coordinator, I started out doing some data entry for a project that they had done before I was hired. But I started noticing different patterns and asking different questions and asking them if they had thought about looking at these kinds of things. And they were like, wow, we hadn't thought of that. Wow, that's a great idea. Yeah, let's go back and look at that. So, it basically brainstormed it and made it a much more robust project than what they had started out with, even though it was existing data. And when we were done, the two physicians agreed that I should be third author because of the value of my contributions to the project. And at that time, I only had a bachelor's. So if you don't have a substantial contribution, you get an acknowledgement. So if I had just stopped at data entry, I would have gotten an acknowledgement and that would have been fine. But that is not searchable. So if you're trying to be competitive, you need to make enough of a contribution to get authorship. Next slide, please. So resources, just very, very briefly, the NIH All of Us is a fantastic project, great way to get involved as a trainee. It has health data from a very diverse group of participants all across the United States with all kinds of diversity, but there's over 414,000 participants. So you don't have to worry about, oh, will I have a big enough N to get, my power analysis? You definitely will. They have training sessions. You can sign up through a mentor at your institution. They can get trained too. And they actually have on their website ways to get involved. Next slide, I think, is just, don't forget that on your ARIS application, you can list up to 10 experiences, including research. You describe 3 of them as the most meaningful. So if you had a really meaningful research experience and you want to describe that, you can. And then AAMC has a careers in medicine database of clinical and research opportunities. There are almost 100 entries for all different kinds of research that are searchable, and it's in the US, Canada, and abroad. And they just define whether it's summer or year round so that you can tailor it according to what your availability and interests are. Next slide, please. This is a great article. I'm not sure if it's still in print. Oops. But by Dr. Barbara Gastel, journal submissions other than scientific papers. So, for example, how do you structure a case report? How do you structure original, not necessarily original research, a brief report? There you go. CITI, like I mentioned, protocol builder, just like it sounds like, helps you to build a protocol if your institution is a subscriber. And last but not least, shameless plug for me and my colleagues from Ohio and New York colleges of osteopathic medicine. We did a series of workshops for AACOM, and they said you should turn this into a series of journal articles. And so we did. And there are the links to those. So how it's all about getting started in research. And really from the very, very beginning, the previously existing articles that were out there started with how to refine your hypothesis. Like, whoa, that's kind of too far into the movie. We need to start at the very beginning of the movie and start with actually getting started, how to even think of an idea, etc. And that is all for me. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Benoit, Dr. Brooks, and Dr. Dumsha. So we had some questions that were previously submitted by people registering in advance. And we'll maybe have time for a few of those right now, and maybe some of the Q&A that was submitted while we were speaking. So a question about specialty-specific research. How important is it that we do research in the specialty that we apply to for residency?
I think that's a great question, Dr. Waters. I get this question a lot. And based on some of my conversations with different residency directors, there's a couple of different things that they're looking for your research to be able to demonstrate. And one of them is your ability to critically think and to actually be part of the research process. And so for the ones that I've talked to specifically, they're looking for more general principles. And so they don't necessarily care as much that it's in the same specialty of interest. There are some specialties where they really want it in that specialty of interest because it shows dedication to the field. But by and large, the ones that I've talked to have said, we want to see that you can critically think. We want to see that you understand human subjects research. We want to see that you have a concept of what leadership and being a team player is.
You know, and I agree with Dr. Brooks. And, you know, one of the things that happens sometimes, especially at some schools, is they may not have clinical faculty doing research in the area. So I tell students a similar thing. And I said, but if you are involved in research when you're thinking of residency, you should be able to talk about the research passionately and at a high level. So if your name's on the paper, you should know everything about that project. And to me, that is very important, not necessarily the fact that you couldn't identify someone in the area that was your prime interest. That will come.
Do you have anything to add to their answers, Dr. Dumsha?
I second all of that. And yeah, it's important. It's more about the process and the commitment to research, that you understand how to do research. And as Dr. Benoit mentioned, that you can describe it in depth and passionately, not just, yeah, I went to the lab and ran some samples upon occasion.
Thank you so much. All right. So, Dr. Dumsha, you touched on this briefly, and I think a couple of the other panelists went into this a little bit, but for students who are at an institution that's maybe just starting, doesn't have a lot of clinical research opportunities, doesn't necessarily have a lot of perhaps bench research opportunities either, how would you recommend they get started in participating in research?
Great question. So for example, I'm responsible for all 3 campuses of PCOM. So the campus I'm on is turning 125, but we have one that's only 6 and has no bench lab space at all. No animal facility, no any of that stuff. So the kinds of research they're involved in are things like population health research. One of our faculty there has become officially, I forget his title, but like a mentor. In addition to like the trainer that he's done for the All of Us project, he's become, I think they call him a scientific advisor or something like that. But at any rate, he's leading teams of students in doing research using the NIH All of Us database. And they've done some other education research type projects and some other existing data type projects. So one of the things that they're looking at, because it happens to be in a very rural area, is what's the impact of having a new medical school in that area? So is that affecting population health for the population in their area?
Excellent. Dr. Brooks, Dr. Benoit, anything to add?
As a new school, we've seen that with many things, but what we find, and again, to ask around, many of the faculty that come to new schools have prior collaborative efforts with other universities. And sometimes those connections are really good connections. I just had a former student from my days in North Dakota visit our campus. And one of the things he told me at Ohio, he said, at Ohio State, I have some opportunities in my laboratory if you have students that are interested. So those types of relationships are another way, ask around.
I think the only other thing I would add is, because we are also growing our research program, that we encourage our students not to shy away from starting your own project. If you have your own interests, dig into the literature, tell us if it's a good idea. And this kind of goes to one of the other questions that some of our registrants asked about, how do you approach a PI? And I always tell students, if you are starting your own project, vet your idea first. Go to the literature first and just get an idea of if it even makes sense. Has anybody done it before? Does it make sense? And then just write a quick 2-sentence description of what your question is. Doesn't have to be fully refined, doesn't have to be thoroughly baked through yet, but at least so you've got a place to start. And then approach them and say, well, I've already dug into the literature a little bit. I kind of have a good understanding of this, but I need some mentorship. So we very much follow this model of, it's very student-centered, but it's very much faculty and staff mentor.
Absolutely. So that sort of dovetails nicely into one of the questions that was submitted by a participant today. So if you don't have a PI, are you able to conduct research? Or what kinds of scholarly activities could you conduct without a PI, I suppose? And then I guess anything else to add about, if you have a research question, how do you go about finding a PI in addition to what Dr. Brooks mentioned?
We get that question often. And, one of the things is that if you don't have a PI, we do have limited funds, but they're very small amounts of resources that could be available for a student originated type of project. But one thing to keep in mind is that the PI is going to be a mentor. And when you start thinking about publishing, presenting at meetings, networking, try to take your idea and shop it around, like Dr. Brooks indicated, to faculty and people that are there that are more experienced. You'll get a much better return on your time investment.
Also, as I mentioned earlier, don't be too narrowly focused on they have to be an exact match. Think about the team approach. And as the example that I also used was, we have at least one person, we have several people doing research about bones, like just bone would be the sort of the big picture. But one of them is doing orthopedic research, and in fact has a patent on a molecule they invented. So that would be great for orthopedic research. So don't think that you have to go talk to the head of the orthopedic residency program, because that person's actually not even doing research. So find somebody with a related field.
I would also add that at RVU specifically, and it might be this way at other institutions, we do not allow students to do unmentored human subjects research. So if they need an IRB, they must have a mentor at RVU. They must have a PI at RVU.
Yep, we have
They
that as
need
well.
that experience. They just need the experience behind them to make sure that everything is being done properly.
Because you don't know what you don't know as a trainee. That's why you need the experienced person.
Thank you so much. All right, so we had another question that was submitted during our session. And so just to sort of summarize, there's been a noticeable trend in increased publications, especially review articles, for maybe the less impactful journals of scientific research. So do you, as research mentors, have any thoughts on this trend for time-crunched medical students who are trying to increase their research output in an ever-competitive field?
I'll start off by taking that and I think that, yes, there's an increase, but you also have to think about who's going to read it. And if you're doing something just to get it completed quickly and it may not be read, that means it's not going to be read by anyone. Okay, so you want to look at whatever you're doing, even if it's part of a larger team where you can accomplish a bigger project. I would encourage that over just saying, I want to quickly get publications. I've seen students with very large numbers of publications that are almost mind-boggling large through the years, that it did not help them when it came down to applications for residencies and other things. So you want to look to strike a balance. And you want to think about, are you putting it in a journal that's in a good journal? And I also caution against predatory journals. And you can consult your librarians on your campus and your faculty, because you do not want to get trying to publish something quickly in a predatory journal that'll hold you or your data hostage.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And the other thing, I've seen that recently because I was one of the panelists for the Student Researcher of the Year from AACOM. And yeah, you could have 20 publications, but if the impact factor is tiny, that's not as good as having one that was more thorough, that was successfully published, and one with a better impact factor. Now, the balance with that too is, don't think that you're going to submit to JAMA or academic medicine or something like that, because the rejection rate is so high. It's like saying that you're going to go to the NIH with your little project rather than going to a private funder or internal funding. So you can't shoot for the stars, but don't have 20 publications in low impact journals. Take more time, do a more thorough job, and go for there's so many journals out there, but find one with a better impact factor. That's the other thing, is making sure that it's a match for what your work is. So don't just submit to the Journal of Surgery, find one that's more tailored to your exact field, for example, subspecialty.
One of the tools that we often send students to is something called Jane online. It's a journal. It identifies the journals. That is a great tool. And you just write in Jane and put in something about journal identifier, and you can put in keywords, the title, your abstract, and it lists the top journals for you with their impact factors. And it's a really nice tool to help you decide which journal. And then I usually tell students to look for their top 3. Do one that's maybe a higher impact factor, and then if you get rejected from that, do kind of a mid-tier, and then one that's lower. And a lot of times students don't even know what impact factor means. And so just kind of my rule of thumb is to tell students a good impact factor is something above 3. That's usually pretty solid. So, but then you have to bear in mind that case reports are not going to get cited as much. And so an impact factor for a case report, if you get an impact factor of 1, that's pretty good for a case report. So you just kind of have to figure out who your audience is and how you're trying to target them, because you want the people who you're writing for to actually see what you're trying to show. So. And
Oh.
I see in the chat that there's a question on that. I'll put that in the chat, that Jane website.
Much, Dr. Brooks. Well, it's 6:01, so I don't want to take any more valuable time from our panelists or our attendees. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to AACOM and AOGME for sponsoring this webinar. Thank you to Dr. Brooks, Dr. Dumsha, and Dr. Benoit for their excellent advice and guidance. And for any of the attendees, please join us on Monday, March 11th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time for the follow-up session to this webinar, which will give us more of the Q&A opportunity. We'll have panelists and other research experts available in breakout rooms to get more individualized and one-on-one type advice and questions. The registration link has been posted in the chat. Thank you again to everyone who joined us today. And if you have any questions, please contact AOGME at aacom.org. Thank you so much. Have a great evening, everyone.